We are continuing our study in the book of Acts. We've worked our way up to chapter 24. At this section of the book of Acts, Paul has finished his third missionary journey. Paul has taken a route back to Jerusalem. And when he was in Jerusalem, he met with James and the elders and the church leaders who encouraged him to take a Nazirite vow, to sponsor some men taking a Nazirite vow, that he would be looked on favorably by the Jews. He would try to encourage the Jewish people that he was still a devout Jew. And so Paul, as he was taking these Nazirite vows, went into the temple. And in the temple, some Jews from Asia saw Paul in the temple. They wrongly jumped to the conclusion that he had defiled the temple by bringing Gentiles into the temple. And consequently, a riot started. They grabbed Paul, they began beating him, and this prompted the soldiers, the garrison right next to the temple, to come out and rescue Paul. The soldiers took Paul. Paul had a chance to address the crowd. Another riot started to break out. The next day, the commander set Paul before the Sanhedrin Council, this council of 70 elders in Jerusalem, who Paul judiciously perceived that there were some from the Sadducees, some from the Pharisees, and he pointed out that he was a Pharisee, that he was on trial for being a Pharisee and believing in the resurrection. This threatened to start another riot, wherein the soldiers took Paul back into protective custody. The governor, the tribune, was trying to figure out what to do with Paul, when Paul's nephew comes onto the scene with this amazing story that there were 40 assassins, 40 men who had set out to assassinate Paul. They took a vow that they would neither eat nor drink until Paul was dead. So with this troubling news, the commander of the fortress, Tribune Lysias, decided to whisk Paul off to Caesarea. So in the middle of the night, they left to go to Caesarea with 470 men guarding Paul. So you can see the tribune took these assassins very seriously, took him to Governor Felix. Governor Felix interviewed Paul very briefly, asked Paul where he was from. Paul pointed out he was from Tarsus. The governor realized that was in his province, so Paul was under his jurisdiction. And so the governor put Paul up. He was instructed to stay there, to remain there, until Paul's accusers could come and bring their charges against him. And so we pick up the story here in Caesarea. Paul has been there under the protection of the governor. And here we pick up in Acts 24:1. And after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, descended with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. So Paul was in Caesarea for 5 days, and after that, the party of the high priest's entourage arrived in Caesarea, ready to present their case against Paul. Now, Caesarea was a beautiful city, Roman city, built by Herod. It was a jewel there on the coast of the Mediterranean. And Paul was kept in captivity there, loose captivity. His friends were allowed to see him. He wasn't in a dark dungeon someplace, but he was kept in the hall. And this palace had a swimming pool in the middle of the compound, surrounded by this colonnaded porch. The swimming pool was more than 100 feet long and 60 feet wide. So it was a very luxurious place where Paul was kept. And after 5 days, the high priest descended with the elders. Now, when it says descended, whenever they talk about coming from Jerusalem, Jerusalem is on the top of a mountain. And so they typically speak about coming down from Jerusalem, no matter where you're going. So they came down with Jerusalem, and they had with them a certain orator. So this orator, this is a lawyer. And the fact that he's named Tertullus tells us that this is a Roman lawyer, and his job was to inform the governor against Paul. So Ananias, the high priest, and the Jewish authorities were not familiar with Roman law. They weren't prepared to argue cases before a Roman court, and so they hired this lawyer. And I'm sure this was a high-powered lawyer. You can see he's very eloquent. I chuckled at one of the commentaries who called Tertullius a windbag. He was an articulate speaker, and we'll see that in a minute. Verse 2. And when he was called forth, Tertullius began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that thy very worthy deeds are done to this nation by thy providence. So Paul was called forth. Paul was in prison. They called Paul forth. And once everyone was assembled, Tertullius, the gifted lawyer, begins to bring charges against Paul. Now, you can see here that he starts off with this flowery speech, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. So Tertullius was very skilled at flattery. He wanted to flatter the governor. He wanted to soften the governor up. He wanted to make the governor open to his ideas, open to his to the charges he was bringing against Paul. But you have to understand that these were very turbulent times that they were living in. Governor Felix was not that popular. Governor Felix, there was a lot of turmoil, turbulence in the region at the time. We saw that Ananias was the high priest, and a very significant event happened right around this time. Biblical scholars are not sure if this happened before or after Paul was put on trial. But what happened is the high priest named Jonathan was murdered. And Felix is suspected to have arranged this murder of the high priest. So the sequence of events, as near as I could figure from reading about this, is Ananias was high priest. Ananias was not doing a very good job. Ananias was called to Rome to answer for charges of malfeasance. When he was called away, Jonathan became high priest. Jonathan was formerly a friend of Felix the governor. In fact, Jonathan had helped Felix get the appointment as governor of Judea. But the relationship soured between Jonathan and Felix, and Jonathan began to criticize Felix and say that he was doing a poor job on this, that, or the other thing. And Felix became increasingly worried that Jonathan, who helped him secure the position, would cause him to lose his position as governor. And so Felix took in one of Jonathan's friends, one of his trusted advisors named Doris comes into the picture. Doris was a trusted advisor to Jonathan, one of his inside men, and Governor Felix convinces this man to turn against his friend. So Felix gave him a large sum of money to hire these assassins and kill Jonathan the high priest. All this is going on in the background of this trial of Paul. So Jonathan is killed. Ananias was the most recent high priest who was still alive. And so Ananias comes back into the priesthood as the high priest temporarily until they can arrange to bring forth a new high priest. So this is a situation that's going on, and it's not clear whether all this turmoil happened before or after Paul was put on trial, but it was very turbulent times. Nonetheless, Tertullius glosses over all of that, whitewashes that, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that thy very worthy deeds are done into this nation by thy providence. So you can see Tertullius is buttering up Governor Felix here with this speech. Continuing on in verse 3, Tertullius says, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. So what Tertullius is saying here is that we accept the peace that you bring to our nation. We like it. We accept the peace, and we would like to have the peace. And in all places. So they acknowledge that Felix is the peaceful governor, he says, all the time we acknowledge this. Not just when we're here in front of you presenting our case, but he's basically telling a pack of lies. But in all the places, all times, we acknowledge your providence. Most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. So the lawyer here is doing his lawyer speech. Continuing in verse 4, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear of us thy clemency a few words. So we wouldn't say it like this today, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee. What we would say today is, there's a lot more that I could share. Or we would say, there's more where that came from. In other words, Tertullius is intentionally making the story short for the benefit of the governor. And he's praying, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency, a few words. So he's appealing to the governor's sense of duty, sense of responsibility, to listen carefully to the case that's being brought before him today. And so with that, we actually move into the charges that Tertullius is going to bring against Paul. Verse 5. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of Nazarenes. So here in verse 5, we're presented with the first three charges. First, that we have found this man a pestilent fellow. Literally, Paul is a pest, a disease. That contact with Paul makes people sick. That was the charge that Tertullius was leveling against Paul. That was his first charge. That Paul, being around Paul, makes people sick in the head. That he is pestilential. This was something that was common, that the Romans, a charge that they leveled against serious criminals. It's found in other historical documents, this charge of being a pestilential fellow. This was a serious charge that was being brought against Paul because the Romans valued peace. Look at it, he continues with the second charge, a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world. So these charges of sedition, also very serious charges, actually charges worthy of death, that if Paul would be convicted of sedition, he would be put to death, he would be executed. And so Tertullius is not fooling around here. He is going for the whole hog. He wants to have Paul executed. And a mover of sedition. Sedition is different than treason. Sedition is the idea that you are engaging in conduct or speech that incites rebellion. That you are encouraging people to rebel against the government, against the authorities. Treason is actively waging war against the government or giving aid to the enemies of the state. So there's sedition and treason. Paul was being accused of sedition here, that is, inciting rebellion. A very serious charge. And thirdly, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So they said that Paul was a very important, prominent figure among the sect of the Nazarenes. This is the Jews' way of referring to Christians. That they called Christians a sect, a Jewish sect, the Nazarenes. So Nazareth was the town Jesus was from. It was a small town. It was not a very prominent place. In fact, it was kind of a backwards, out-of-the-way place. And this was used in a derisive manner, that they were saying that it was a sect of the Nazarenes. It was a poor, backward sect, is what the lawyer was driving at. Continuing in verse 6, so there's bringing another charge, a fourth charge against Paul, who has also gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our own laws. So was not only Paul guilty of sedition, inciting rebellion, the lawyer says that Paul was profaning the temple. that Paul was not an honest man, that Paul was not a respectful citizen. He didn't respect the civil authorities, and Paul was not a devout Jew. That Paul was a troublemaker. This is the picture he's painting of Paul, that he was a troublemaker, profaning the temple. Of course, these things are not true. And look at the lawyer speak here, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. That is really a whopper of a lie. Paul was not taken and judged according to any law. A mob grabbed Paul when he was visiting the temple and would have murdered him. But the lawyer whitewashes all of that, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. Moving on to verse 7, but the chief captain, Lysias, came upon us and with great violence took him away out of our hands. So the lawyer is painting the picture that they were in an orderly procession, proceeding to bring charges against Paul, and that somehow this tribune interjects himself into the situation and grabs Paul. So you can see how the thing is colored against Paul, how these lies are manifesting one on top of the other. It is true that Lysias came with great violence and took him out of their hands, but that was because they were ready to murder him and start a riot. Verse 8, talking about Lysias commanding his accusers to come unto thee, that's Felix, by examination of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. So the lawyer points out that the tribune said that if they had charges to bring against Paul, they would have to present themselves before the governor. That's where these charges should be brought, if any were to be made. And look at the hubris here. By examination of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. So the lawyer is telling the judge, you can see for yourself this guy's a troublemaker. That's in essence what he is saying. He says, you can question him and you can see very obviously that he is a bad person. Whereof we accuse him. So they were accusing this. But you have to bear in mind that when they took Paul first of all had a chance to address the crowd right after they took him into custody. That Paul was brought before the Sanhedrin to figure out what the charges were against him. And notice Tertullius makes no mention of the assassins. These 40 assassins committed themselves not to eat or drink until they had murdered Paul. So none of this is brought into the picture. He is coloring the picture. We would call this today spin doctoring. He was spinning this to put it in the most favorable terms for the case. And the Jews also assented, verse 9. The Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. So the Jews, the highest authority of the land, the religious leaders, were agreeing with this pack of lies. We saw earlier that this Jewish leaders, who you would expect to be able to get a fair trial in front of, no, they were not interested in justice. They were only interested in preserving their power. That's what they were interested in. They did not care about truth. They cared about power and money. And so they agreed, they assented to all these things that the lawyer said. Yep, that's true. Yep, that's true. That's what they did. They were just go along, get along with the things that the lawyer was saying. Verse 10. Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. So here we see Paul waiting until the governor beckoned him to speak, whether it was with a nod whether it was a gesture of the hand, it doesn't say. But the point is that Paul was respectful of the court. That Paul didn't jump up in the middle of the charges, protesting his innocence out of turn. He waited very respectfully until the charges were brought. And then when the governor acknowledged him and it was his turn to speak, then he gets up and he gives this very eloquent defense. And he answers, "For as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge of this nation." Compare this to the oily speech that Tertullius gave, that Paul is speaking very honestly here. He acknowledges that Felix has been a judge for many years. This is probably 7 years that Tertullius has been the governor here. 7, some say 10, some say 6, at this point in his career. But Paul knows that he's been around enough that he is familiar with the Jews. And Paul feels confident that since he is familiar with the Jews and their wily ways, that I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. So Paul feels that he can get an honest hearing from Felix, who would be familiar with the type of manipulating and shenanigans that go on with the Jews. Verse 11. "Because that thou thyself mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to the worship." So the first thing Paul points out to the governor, I've only been in Jerusalem 12 days. There's no way I could have participated in as much mischief as the charges against me indicate. 12 days that Paul was in Jerusalem. Now the counting of these 12 days, it's not, historians don't agree perfectly on this. There's some reason to wonder because Paul was taking a vow and he was seized about the 7th day and about the end of the day. But attempting to count these, the first day Paul arrived in Jerusalem. The second day he meets with James and the elders. The third day Paul begins the purification ritual in the temple. And on the last day, about the 7th day, it says, Paul was seized by the crowd. So here we are on day 10. Paul is before the Sanhedrin. And the night following is when the Lord appeared to Paul and encouraged him, telling Paul that he must appear before Rome. That he must appear before the authorities in Rome. So it was great encouragement to Paul to have the Lord appear and stand by him. Day 11, there was a plot against Paul's life. He was secretly transferred from Jerusalem to Caesarea by the Roman soldiers. In day 12, Paul is delivered to the governor Felix in Caesarea. And then it says, after 5 days, the accusers arrived. So that's the 12 days. So 12 days he was only in Jerusalem. So Paul's second point is, verse 12, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogue nor the city. So it was very common to go into the temple and have these theological discussions. Remember, Jesus was in the temple having a discussion with certain men, certain leaders. Paul would go into the temple and discuss these things. But he says when he was in Jerusalem, he didn't do any of this. Nobody could say he was in the temple disputing, discussing, arguing with anyone in the temple. Not only was he didn't do that in the temple, neither did he raise up the people. He didn't go into the crowd and try to rile up the crowd. Paul didn't do that. He didn't go through the streets crying out, getting on a soapbox and making his speeches. He didn't do any of those things. Neither did he do it in the synagogue. He didn't travel from synagogue to synagogue, stirring up strife. He didn't do that. And he didn't do it not only in the countryside, but he didn't do it in the city either. So nowhere was Paul found creating these type of disturbances that the lawyer was trying to prove, what the lawyer was bringing against him. Verse 13, neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. So Paul is very bold, saying that there's no basis for these charges. They can't prove these. These are empty words. Where are the charges? Where are the witnesses to prove these charges that they're bringing against Paul? And there are none. There are no witnesses. There is no proof of these things. They are simply empty words. In verse 14, now Paul switches from denying the charges, pointing out that these things are not true. Now here in verse 14, he switches and he affirms what he does believe. Verse 14, but this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. So they had said that Paul was profaning the temple. Paul here says that he believes all that's written in the law and the prophets. He would not go about profaning the temple. And the fact that he is confessing unto thee, Paul is telling the truth. He is not ashamed of his testimony that after the way which they call heresy, this was the sect of the Nazarenes. They accused him of being a part of the sect of the Nazarenes. This was considered a heresy to them. Paul is saying that, yes, I am a follower of this way. I do acknowledge the fact that Christ is my Savior. That's what he meant by after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers. So Paul is connecting the sect of the Nazarenes to Judaism. Basically saying that there's no conflict. There's no reason for these accusations. There's no reason for these charges against me. That he believes all things which are written in the law and the prophets. That Paul acknowledges and confesses that he is an honest fellow who loves God. And next week, Lord willing, we will continue on with Paul's defense. Praise God.